When my mom passed away, I was 25 years old, freshly graduated from college, and still trying to find a foothold in the adult world. Her death wasn't sudden, she had been battling cancer for nearly 2 years, but nothing really prepares you for the finality of losing the one person who made everything feel stable. My mother, Laura Maddox, wasn't just a mom. She was a powerhouse. She built a textile company from the ground up, starting from her garage with one industrial sewing machine and a vision. Over 15 years, she turned it into a regional name, supplying custom fabrics and textile design solutions to mid-size fashion brands and interior designers. She didn't just run the business, she was the business. Every process, every client relationship, every bit of branding had her fingerprint on it. People admired her for her determination, her kindness, and her stubborn refusal to cut corners. She also made it clear, both in life and in her will, that the company was meant to be a family legacy. When she passed, she left behind a clear and legally binding will. The company would be split 50-50 between me and my father, Charles. She wanted us to co-run it, to continue what she started, as a team. There was no ambiguity in the document. I was not a silent partner. I was not an investor. I was a co-owner, with equal rights and responsibilities. She believed I was ready. We had spent countless evenings in her office, long before her diagnosis, discussing client strategies, reviewing contracts, and sketching out marketing plans. I had shadowed her for years, and in the last 6 months before her death, I had started taking on more official responsibilities. She wasn't just preparing me, she was integrating me. This business was supposed to be our future, mine and hers, and when she was gone, mine and my father's. But that vision dissolved the moment she was buried. My father, Charles Maddox, did not take the will seriously. Or rather, he read it, acknowledged it publicly in the way people nod at a eulogy, then quietly began acting as if it had never existed. He had never been deeply involved in the business during her lifetime. He worked as a CPA for a medical firm and had always made it seem like my mother's company was some kind of expensive hobby, something to humor but not something serious. I think, deep down, he resented how successful she became, how people respected her, how she didn't rely on his input or validation. After her death, he walked into the company's offices like a man reclaiming a property that had been wrongfully occupied. Within the first week, he called a staff meeting, without telling me, and announced he would be stepping in as interim CEO until things stabilized. That phrase alone made my blood boil. There was nothing unstable about the business. Yes, we were grieving, but the financials were strong, our client list was robust, and operations were humming. My mother had planned for this. She left behind transition documents, a succession plan, and even had meetings with our senior team in the weeks leading up to her death. She wanted everyone to be prepared and confident in the company's future. But my father ignored all of that. He changed the locks to the executive offices. He had his name put on all outgoing communications. He emailed our vendors and suppliers, informing them that ownership structure had changed and that all decisions would now be routed through him. My access to company email was revoked. I confronted him, calmly at first, reminding him of the will, the legal documents, the conversations we'd all had with Mom. He waved me off, telling me I was too emotional and needed time to grieve. That I didn't understand the pressures of running a business. That I should trust him to handle it for now. For a few days, I told myself maybe he was just overwhelmed, maybe he'd come around, maybe he was acting out of grief. But then he started making actual changes, gutting departments, canceling contracts, replacing our marketing lead with his golfing buddy from church who had never worked in textiles in his life. I wasn't even invited to strategy meetings. It became clear that he didn't view me as a partner, or even as a stakeholder. He saw me as an obstacle. I hired a lawyer. Not because I wanted to sue my own father, but because I needed clarity. I needed to know what my rights were. The attorney reviewed the will, the business incorporation documents, and my mother's succession plan. Legally, I was in the right. I was a 50% owner with equal authority over all decisions. The only reason he was getting away with this was because I hadn't formally contested his actions yet. My lawyer advised we send a letter of demand, professional, firm, and backed by legal precedent. So we did. Charles didn't respond. Instead, he had the company's legal counsel send back a vague reply questioning the interpretation of the will and citing his role as surviving spouse and majority decision-maker under internal corporate bylaws. It was garbage. He was twisting clauses out of context, relying on the fact that corporate governance is often a labyrinth no one wants to navigate unless they absolutely have to. I offered to meet in person, with mediators, with lawyers, without lawyers, any way that might get us to sit down and talk like family. He refused every time. He told relatives I was trying to take away his livelihood, spinning a narrative that made me sound greedy and ungrateful, as if I hadn't spent years preparing to take over this business, as if I hadn't spent nights sleeping in the office while my mother was in the hospital, doing everything I could to keep things running smoothly for her. The employees started to notice. Several of the senior staff came to me quietly, asking if what they'd heard was true, if I had been written out of the company. When I told them the truth, some were furious on my behalf. A few even considered quitting, but I begged them not to. I didn't want the company to fall apart. I just wanted to honor my mother's wishes. I wanted to be allowed to step into the role she had prepared me for. But every path I took to do that was blocked by the man who had once promised her, in front of a notary and our family, that he would respect her final wishes. Charles didn't just take over the company, he crowned himself king, completely ignoring every structure, legacy, and principle my mother had built the business on. It was like watching someone light a home on fire while still standing in it, fully aware of the consequences but too arrogant to care. Within weeks, he had transformed the company from a professional, respected brand into a personal playground for his ego and whims. One of the first things he did, and by far the most insulting, was appointing his new girlfriend, Vanessa, as our executive operations director. Vanessa was 28, barely 3 years older than me, and had absolutely no relevant experience in textiles, business management, or operations of any kind. Before this, she had been managing a yoga studio and doing brand partnerships on Instagram. Her resume was thinner than a business card, and yet Charles gave her a corner office, an assistant, and signing authority. Her presence alone was disruptive. She walked around the office like she was auditioning for a reality show, barking orders at employees who had been working in the company longer than she had been out of college. She wanted to rebrand our entire aesthetic to something more millennial chic, even though our brand was already doing well with the market we served. She ordered our design team to scrap months of work in favor of vague, mood board concepts that made no sense for our clients. When our senior operations manager, who had been with the company for over a decade, tried to question her directives, Vanessa told her she needed to get with the times or move on. A week later, she was fired. It wasn't just internal chaos. Charles began dismantling the external foundation too. He canceled long-term supplier contracts my mother had painstakingly negotiated, claiming we could get better deals elsewhere. But instead of sourcing reputable vendors, he funneled business to companies run by his acquaintances, people with no track record in the industry, offering low-grade materials at inflated prices. We started getting complaints from clients about quality issues and missed deadlines. He ignored them. I watched in disbelief as clients who had been loyal to us for years began quietly pulling their contracts, choosing to take their business to competitors rather than deal with the circus our company had become. And then there was the money. This was where things went from chaotic to genuinely alarming. Charles began diverting company funds into vague side projects, some of which he refused to even disclose to the finance team. One of these projects was some kind of entrepreneur incubator he claimed would help young fashion designers develop their brands using our manufacturing resources. But there was no structure, no oversight, and no contracts. He leased a separate office space downtown under the company's name and began pouring money into it, renovations, PR events, consultants, catering, all charged to the company. When I asked to see the financial breakdown or even a business plan, he told me it was above my level and handled internally. I was the internal. I was a 50% owner. But he treated me like an intern who had overstayed her welcome. It didn't stop there. He bought new company vehicles, luxury SUVs, one of which Vanessa drove daily even though her job didn't require travel. He threw launch parties for non-existent product lines, hiring event planners, caterers, and entertainment on the company's dime. At one point, he hired a celebrity DJ for a networking mixer that ended up being just him, Vanessa, a few of their friends, and some influencers they knew. Tens of thousands of dollars wasted, while our production team was told to cut hours due to budget constraints. I tried confronting him many times. The first few attempts were behind closed doors, trying to maintain some sense of dignity and professionalism. I brought financial reports, client complaints, team feedback, all carefully documented. He didn't read a single page. He would lean back in his chair, smirk, and tell me I was too young to understand how business really works. That I should just relax and enjoy the ride. When I pushed back harder, reminding him again of my equal ownership and my mother's documented wishes, he laughed in my face. Not a nervous chuckle, not a dismissive scoff, but a full, open laugh like I had just told the most ridiculous joke he'd ever heard. He looked me in the eyes and said, "You think this company was built for you? Your mother ran it, sure, but she was soft. She didn't understand how to scale. I'm finally turning this place into something real." It was like he had rewritten history in his head. My mother was the company. Without her, it would never have existed. She didn't just build it, she nurtured it, expanded it, made it profitable, made it respected. And now here he was, acting like he had to clean up some amateur mess she left behind, using her death as a blank check to bulldoze everything she'd built. There was no reasoning with him. Every time I tried to assert my legal and operational rights, he found a new way to undermine me, cutting off my access to company records, excluding me from meetings, lying to staff about my role. At one point, he sent a company-wide email stating that I was taking time off for personal reasons and that all decisions would go through him until further notice. I hadn't taken a single day off. I was still in the office every day, trying to hold things together behind the scenes, but he had effectively ghosted me from my own company. Employees were confused, vendors were frustrated, and clients were losing faith. But Charles didn't care. As long as the company's credit card still worked and he could plaster his name on a few press releases, he considered it a success. What made it worse was that I could feel my mother's presence everywhere, in the layouts she designed, the materials she selected, the legacy she left. And yet the man who once stood beside her, who claimed to love her, was tearing it all down, brick by brick, like it meant nothing. The day I discovered the loan, everything I had feared about my father's recklessness and deceit solidified into something undeniable and horrifying. I had been trying to monitor what little financial activity I still had access to, mostly through back channels and partial reports that sympathetic employees quietly forwarded me. I had long suspected Charles was hiding things, but I didn't expect to find something this catastrophic. It started when one of our long-term suppliers reached out to me privately, asking if we were having cash flow problems. I told him no, at least not officially, but he said he had heard from someone in accounting that the company had taken out a large business loan recently, something in the range of several $1,000,000. My stomach dropped. There had been no discussion of a loan, no board approval, no paperwork that ever crossed my desk. A loan of that size required both owners' signatures by law. Mine was never requested. That night, I stayed up combing through every document I could access from old archives and email threads, trying to find any mention of it. The next morning, I contacted one of the junior accountants who I knew was loyal to my mother's memory and asked her, as discreetly as possible, to look into the claim. 2 days later, she called me, her voice shaky, saying she found something really bad. She sent me a scanned copy of the loan agreement. There it was, in black and white, an enormous commercial loan drawn against the company's assets, using both my father's and my signatures. Except mine wasn't mine. It was a forgery. A clean one, but a forgery nonetheless. I knew instantly. The loops in the letters, the spacing, even the angle, it was close but off, just enough that anyone who knew my handwriting could tell. He hadn't even bothered to hide it particularly well. The bank had already approved it and the money had been disbursed weeks earlier. The loan amount made my head spin. He had mortgaged nearly everything the company owned, real estate, equipment, even intellectual property rights. It was collateralized to the point of suffocation. He had bet the company's future on whatever ridiculous schemes he was funding, and worse, he had dragged my name and signature into it. I felt physically sick. My hands were shaking when I printed out the documents and highlighted the sections showing the signatures. I went to his office immediately, the papers clutched in my hand, determined to confront him face to face. When I walked in, Vanessa was sitting on his desk, scrolling through her phone like she owned the place. I ignored her completely and slammed the documents down in front of him. He looked at them for a second, then back at me, completely unbothered, as if I had just dropped off some routine paperwork. I told him I knew what he had done. I told him I had proof. I said the words slowly, each one laced with a level of anger I didn't know I was capable of. He leaned back in his chair, smirked, and said, "Proof of what? That I saved this company while you were too busy pretending to be your mother?" My jaw tightened, and I pointed at the signature line, the place where my name sat like a stain. I told him that forging a co-owner's signature was a felony, that I could take this to the authorities, to the bank, to the courts. He didn't even blink. Instead, he laughed. A deep, arrogant, mocking laugh that filled the room and made Vanessa giggle like a child. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, and said, "You really think this company is yours because of a will? You're just a girl in heels playing dress-up, pretending you understand business." His tone was sharp, contemptuous, dripping with disdain. It wasn't just an insult, it was an erasure. He wanted me to feel small, powerless, irrelevant. He wanted me to doubt my place in my own mother's legacy. For a moment, I stood there frozen, my mind caught between rage and disbelief. Every word felt like a blade. I told him he was destroying everything Mom built, that she trusted him to protect this company, to protect me, and that he was spitting on her memory. He just shrugged and said something about how she never understood what real power looked like, and that he was finally modernizing things. I could barely see straight at that point. My voice cracked when I told him this was the last time he would ever use my name to cover his crimes. He laughed again, and said, "Then do something about it." So I did. That night, I gathered every document, every email, every record I could find, anything that showed discrepancies in financial transfers, unauthorized expenses, missing funds, and of course, the forged signature. I scanned everything, backed it up to multiple drives, and contacted my lawyer the next morning. This time, I wasn't asking for advice or guidance. I told him flatly that I wanted to take legal action. He asked me what changed, and I told him, he forged my name. He mortgaged my mother's company behind my back. I'm done playing nice. There was no going back after that. I didn't care about the fallout anymore. I didn't care that he was my father. I didn't care that this would get ugly. I cared about the company, about my mother's name, and about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. The man sitting in that office wasn't a grieving husband trying to save a business, he was a fraud, an imposter CEO, and I was finally ready to expose him for what he really was. Filing the lawsuit felt like both an act of desperation and defiance. After months of watching my father dismantle everything my mother had built, the forged loan was the breaking point. My lawyer and I worked around the clock for weeks preparing the case, gathering every piece of evidence we could, the forged signature, the fraudulent loan agreement, the diverted funds, the unauthorized company expenditures, and internal communications showing that Charles had knowingly excluded me from decision-making. When the papers were finally filed, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. It was official now. I was suing my own father, and there was no pretending anymore that this was just a family dispute. It was a battle for survival, mine and the company's. Charles didn't flinch. In fact, he seemed almost excited when he was served. Within days, he fired back with a countersuit so aggressive and manipulative it made me sick to my stomach. His claim? That I was mentally unstable and unfit to hold executive authority, accusing me of erratic behavior, emotional instability, and even suggesting that I had been harassing staff. It was an obvious smear campaign, designed not to prove anything but to paint me as an unreliable narrator in the eyes of the court. The irony of it all was unbearable. He was the one forging documents and stealing money, yet he wanted to portray me as the unstable one. His legal team was enormous, an entire fleet of attorneys from a top-tier corporate law firm, the kind that charged hourly rates higher than most people's monthly rent. They filed motion after motion, requesting delays, demanding excessive documentation, and sending intimidating letters to my witnesses. Their strategy was clear: exhaust me, drain my resources, and make me regret ever standing up to him. But I refused to back down. My lawyer warned me that it would be a long and brutal process, and that my father's influence could complicate things. I knew Charles had friends in high places, but I didn't realize just how deep his connections ran until the court assigned our judge. When I heard the name Judge Alan Whitmore, I froze. It didn't register at first, just another name on a document, until I remembered where I'd heard it before. Alan Whitmore was my father's golf buddy, a man I had seen countless times at our old country club when I was younger. He and my father used to play together every weekend, drinking, laughing, sharing inside jokes I never cared to understand. I could still remember the way Charles used to brag about him at dinner, saying things like, "Alan's one of the few people who still gets how the system works." Now, that same man was the one presiding over my case. My attorney immediately filed a motion for recusal, outlining the obvious conflict of interest. We attached photos, social media posts, and even club records showing years of personal connection between the two men. It was undeniable that they knew each other closely. We made it clear that having Judge Whitmore on the case created an appearance of bias that could undermine the integrity of the trial. It should have been a straightforward decision. But the motion was denied without explanation. No hearing, no justification, just a curt one-line rejection from the court. When my lawyer read the denial aloud, my stomach dropped. I remember sitting there, gripping the edge of the table so hard my fingers hurt, while my heart pounded in my ears. It felt like the walls were closing in. That was the moment I realized we were walking into a rigged courtroom. The tone of the proceedings changed instantly. Every pre-trial conference felt skewed. My lawyer's objections were cut off mid-sentence. Our motions were delayed, dismissed, or under review indefinitely, while the defense's requests were granted almost immediately. Charles and his attorneys acted like they owned the place, strutting into the courtroom with smug smiles, cracking jokes with the bailiff, exchanging casual nods with the judge. I watched it all, sitting at my table, feeling smaller by the minute but forcing myself not to look away. My father would sit across from me, perfectly composed, dressed in one of his tailored suits, pretending to be the reasonable one. Occasionally, he'd glance in my direction and give me that same look he always did when he thought he had already won, a mixture of amusement and pity. I knew he was relishing every moment. To him, this wasn't about justice or truth. It was about domination, control, proving that no matter what I did, I would never escape his shadow. Behind the scenes, I could feel the manipulation seeping through every interaction. Court clerks seemed hesitant to engage with our filings. Scheduling requests mysteriously disappeared from the docket. My attorney, a seasoned litigator who had seen just about everything, looked genuinely rattled. He told me in private that he had never seen a recusal request with such obvious merit get tossed aside so quickly. He warned me to prepare myself, because this was no longer just a legal fight, it was political, personal, and stacked against us from the start. The first hearing made that crystal clear. Whitmore presided over the room with a casual familiarity toward Charles, addressing him by his first name more than once, while he referred to me coldly as Ms. Maddox. My lawyer objected to the tone, but Whitmore brushed it off with a smirk. Every time we tried to introduce evidence, emails showing my father's misconduct, records of forged documents, the defense interrupted, objected, and somehow always got the last word. The judge allowed it all. I sat there, feeling the heat rise behind my eyes, doing everything I could to stay composed. The entire time, Charles sat back like a man watching a movie he already knew the ending to. Every ruling, every sidelong glance, every subtle smirk confirmed what I already feared: this trial wasn't about truth or fairness. It was about power, and my father had rigged the system long before we ever set foot in that courtroom. Sitting in that courtroom, I realized with a crushing sense of finality that I wasn't just fighting my father, I was fighting an entire system that had decided before the first word was spoken that my voice didn't matter. Watching him take the stand was like watching a theater performance written specifically to manipulate and mislead. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and launched into a carefully rehearsed narrative that twisted every piece of our shared history into something unrecognizable. He called himself a grieving husband who had stepped into the chaos after my mother's death to stabilize the company and protect it from what he described as internal dysfunction. He looked directly at the jury when he spoke about his devotion to her vision, about the sleepless nights he spent keeping the business afloat, about how difficult it was to raise a daughter while managing a growing enterprise in mourning. Every word was a lie, but it was delivered with such confidence, such ease, that even I had to remind myself not to flinch. Then came the part that I'll never forget, when he described me. He didn't use my name. He called me his daughter like I was some distant relative, and then began painting a portrait so distorted, so cruel, it didn't even resemble the person I knew myself to be. He said I had always been artistic but unfocused, that I had struggled emotionally after college, that I had taken my mother's death very hard and became obsessed with controlling the company because I didn't know how to process my grief. He spoke about me like I was unstable, irrational, and consumed by some fantasy of ownership. He called me entitled, unprepared, volatile. Every lie felt like a punch to the chest. He weaponized every private conversation, every moment of vulnerability I had shown during the worst time of my life, and turned it into courtroom theater. What broke me wasn't just that he lied, it was that the courtroom let him. The judge, his friend, barely glanced up during his testimony, except to nod or allow his attorneys to stretch the questioning well beyond the limits of relevance. No objections were sustained. No timelines were questioned. The narrative was allowed to expand, unchecked, into this grotesque version of reality where he was the hero and I was the liability. When it was our turn to present witnesses, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Suddenly, the judge was alert, stern, impatient. Every time my attorney asked a question, he interrupted, asking for clarification, accusing us of leading the witness, cutting off testimony with phrases like "let's move on" or "we've heard enough of that." Our first witness was a former senior manager who had resigned after Charles installed Vanessa in her role. She had witnessed the internal collapse, the misuse of funds, the forged approvals, and the blatant exclusion of qualified staff in favor of Charles's personal connections. She barely got through her account before the judge started dismissing her testimony as personal grievances rather than relevant evidence. My attorney tried to push back, citing her years of service and proximity to the financial decisions in question, but Whitmore shut it down, saying, "This court isn't here to entertain disgruntled employees." Another witness, our head of procurement, had direct knowledge of the contract cancellations and substandard vendor replacements. He had invoices, emails, and side-by-side comparisons of material quality that showed a clear decline after Charles took over. He barely spoke for 5 minutes before the judge stopped him with a sharp tone, questioning whether his opinions were expert enough to be admissible. He wasn't offering opinions. He was presenting hard data, but it didn't matter. Whitmore glanced at Charles's lawyers, they exchanged a nod, and just like that, the most damning part of our case was silenced. Even when I took the stand, I was treated like I was on trial for something unspoken. The opposing counsel kept calling me Miss Maddox, saying it in a tone that dripped with condescension, asking questions designed not to reveal truth but to provoke emotion. They brought up irrelevant details from my personal life, times I'd missed meetings to care for my mother during her chemo, moments where I'd been frustrated in emails during the chaos following her death, as if those made me less qualified, less trustworthy, less stable. The judge allowed almost every question. When my lawyer objected, Whitmore raised an eyebrow and said, "The witness seems capable of answering," as if challenging me to perform my composure under pressure. And I did. I answered every question, steady and direct, even when my hands were trembling under the table, even when my heart felt like it would crack open from the injustice of it all. I told the truth, every word of it, about my role in the company, the plans my mother made, the meetings we had, the trust she put in me, and the betrayal I watched unfold piece by piece after her death. But I could feel it in the air, that the truth wasn't what this courtroom was looking for. They weren't interested in facts or documents or testimony from people who lived this experience. They wanted a story, and Charles had already sold them his. The grieving husband trying to protect his legacy from the unstable daughter, it was a story with clean lines, easy sympathy, and no room for complexity. By the end of the day, I stopped hoping the judge would treat us fairly. I stopped expecting that each piece of evidence would matter, that each witness would be allowed to speak, that my voice would carry the same weight as the man who had spent months destroying everything my mother had built. I understood, finally and fully, that this wasn't just a courtroom stacked against me, it was a system built to silence me. It was during the second week of the trial, in the middle of an afternoon recess, when my phone buzzed with a text that would unravel everything I thought I knew about what I was up against. I was sitting alone in the courthouse corridor, drained and numb, staring blankly at the cold tile floor while trying to block out the echo of Charles's smug voice in my mind. The message came from a number I didn't recognize, with no name or context, just a short line of text that made my blood turn to ice. "I have proof your father is a fraud. Want it?" I stared at it for a full minute, unsure if it was a prank, a trap, or a cruel joke from someone trying to mess with me at my lowest point. But something about the directness of it, the lack of flourish, felt real. My instincts flared up. I replied immediately, asking who it was and what proof they were talking about. The response came quickly, "Meet me at the parking lot on 5th and Grant in 30 minutes. I used to work for him." My lawyer was inside talking to one of our expert witnesses, and I didn't tell him. I didn't want anyone to talk me out of it or delay me. I shoved my phone into my pocket, left the courthouse through the side entrance, and walked the 3 blocks with my pulse hammering in my ears. The lot was nearly empty except for a gray sedan parked at the far end under a half-dead tree. As I approached, the passenger side window rolled down, and a woman leaned out. She looked to be in her late 40s, dressed in a simple blouse and jeans, with tired eyes and a face that looked like it had carried too many secrets for too long. "You're Maddox's daughter?" she asked. I nodded, still cautious. She opened the door and handed me a plain black folder, thick with printed pages, receipts, and what looked like internal memos. My name's Helen. I was your father's accountant. Not for the company, personally. He stopped using the firm after your mom died. Thought it would keep things quiet. But I kept copies. I wasn't okay with what I saw. She looked around nervously, as if someone might be watching. He's been hiding money. A lot of it. Shell companies, foreign accounts, payments routed through fake vendor invoices, the whole playbook. But the worst part? She reached into her purse and pulled out a single-page printout with a highlighted transaction. He paid $75,000 to a consulting agency in Arizona. The agency doesn't exist. I tracked the EIN. It was registered under someone named Carter Whitmore. My mouth went dry. I looked down at the document. The name didn't register immediately, but then Helen added, "That's Judge Whitmore's son." I just stood there, the noise of the street fading around me, as the pieces started snapping into place like a slow, sickening puzzle. My father had paid the judge's son. Not the judge directly, he was too careful for that, but through a dummy company that funneled the money into an account tied to someone who shared his last name. The timing of the payment matched the week our motion for recusal was denied. It was too precise to be coincidence. Helen flipped through the rest of the folder, showing me spreadsheets detailing the flow of money through multiple accounts, vendor names that didn't exist, and transactions that had no legitimate business justification. Some of them were routed through companies with vague names like Northern Growth Consulting and Garnet Bay Holdings, all of which led to P.O. boxes and disconnected phone lines. It was textbook laundering, and it had been happening for months, possibly longer. There were also internal emails she had managed to recover from a shared inbox before she left his accounting firm. Messages between Charles and an outside consultant discussing how to separate liability from ownership and avoid triggering co-owner approval on large financial moves. One email even referenced my mother's will directly, with a note that said, "She left too many loose ends. Clean this up before Q3. Helen looked at me and said, "I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I have 2 kids. I couldn't let them grow up thinking this is how the world works." She didn't want money. She didn't want anything from me. She just said, "Do something with it. Before he buries you completely." I thanked her, took the folder, and walked back to the courthouse in a daze, clutching the documents like a lifeline. Everything I had been screaming into a void for months, that he was corrupt, that he was manipulating the system, that the courtroom itself was compromised, was now in my hands, documented and undeniable. He had bought the silence of a judge, hidden his crimes behind fake names and phantom companies, and weaponized the legal system to destroy his own daughter, all while presenting himself as a grieving husband and heroic CEO. It was all right here, in hard numbers, signed memos, bank trails, and connections he never thought anyone would bother to trace. And now, for the first time since this nightmare began, I had the kind of truth he couldn't laugh off or bury with another lie. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with Helen's folder spread out in front of me, laptop open, 3 empty coffee mugs stacked beside me like trophies from a war I hadn't won yet. I went line by line through every document she had given me, every transaction, every shell company name, every email. But I didn't stop there. I wanted to know how far it went, how deep this thing ran, because the payment to the judge's son didn't feel like a one-time bribe, it felt like the tip of something much uglier, much older. Using property records, archived public filings, and every investigative trick I had learned from months of living inside legal documents, I started tracing connections that Helen hadn't even flagged. I searched for every business that had shared addresses with the shell companies. I cross-checked names from old invoices with business registration databases. I scanned LinkedIn profiles, city council meeting minutes, real estate transaction logs, anything that could give me more threads to pull. Around 2 a.m., I found the first real crack. In 2017, Judge Alan Whitmore purchased a vacation home in Sedona, Arizona. Nothing extravagant, but it stood out because of how the sale was processed. The house had been owned by a holding company, Bay Ridge Growth Partners, LLC. On paper, it looked like a basic transaction. The company sold the property to Whitmore for below market value, and the deal went through with little fanfare. But Bay Ridge Growth Partners rang a bell. I checked Helen's folder again, and sure enough, buried in a spreadsheet of payments was a recurring entry for consulting reimbursements sent to Bay Ridge from one of the dummy vendor companies my father used. I dug deeper and pulled Bay Ridge's original incorporation documents. One of the founding members was a name I hadn't seen in years, David Kerr, my father's former business associate, someone I remembered vaguely from childhood as the man who used to show up at our house in expensive cars and leave with envelopes my mother never asked about. A few clicks later, I found an archived SEC document from a now-defunct investment group that listed my father, Charles Maddox, as a strategic advisor to Bay Ridge Growth Partners. The connection was no longer circumstantial. My father had once been directly involved with the company that sold a house to the judge overseeing our case, and that sale was processed through a network of shadow companies he was still actively using to move money. I sat there, stunned, as the picture sharpened into something grotesque. My father hadn't just bribed a judge. He had built a system, an ecosystem of influence, favors, and strategic placements that reached right into the walls of the courthouse. The consulting payment to the judge's son wasn't a fluke or a last-minute attempt to sway a decision. It was part of a long-standing arrangement, part of a larger strategy that went back years. My father didn't need to manipulate the trial. He owned the arena. I found more. Another company, Langston Resource Management, had made multiple payments to both Bay Ridge and a small marketing agency run by a close friend of Whitmore's wife. Langston, it turned out, had also received contracts from my father's business under marketing development, despite having no online presence, no verifiable clients, and no documented output. It was another funnel, another mouth feeding from the same source. Every dollar had a trail, and every trail looped back to someone with a vested interest in seeing my father walk away clean. By dawn, I had a mapped-out network that included at least 6 shell companies, 3 fake vendors, 2 family connections to the judge, and 1 property transaction that tied everything together. I didn't even realize the sun had come up until the light hit the papers and made me blink. I looked down at the chaos of printouts, open browser tabs, and highlighted lines that now formed a picture so damning I could hardly breathe. It was never about me being a weak co-owner or an emotional daughter. It was never about grief, mismanagement, or conflict over vision. My father had known from the beginning that if I ever tried to challenge him, the courtroom wouldn't be neutral ground, it would be another weapon in his arsenal. He had engineered the entire system around himself like a fortress, using old connections, dirty money, and just enough legal camouflage to keep it from being obvious. He didn't just bribe a judge, he cultivated one, fed one, placed one. And now that same man was the one silencing my witnesses, dismissing my evidence, and slowly erasing my case from the record. I felt hollow. Not from exhaustion, but from the clarity that came with understanding the scope of the betrayal. This wasn't just corruption. It was infrastructure. My father had built something designed to last, something he could pass off as coincidence or luck unless someone dragged every inch of it into the light. And now, thanks to Helen and the hours I'd spent connecting the dots, I had the match. I just had to decide where to strike it. I walked into the courtroom that morning with a folder under my arm and a calmness I hadn't felt since the trial began. Not because I was confident in the outcome, nothing in this process had given me reason to believe in fairness, but because for the first time I had something stronger than words. I had proof. Not speculation, not suspicion, not the shaky kind of evidence that could be dismissed with legalese or courtroom theatrics, but real, hard numbers tied to names, dates, and transactions. I had Helen's documents, I had the money trail, I had company registrations, property deeds, and payment records all laid out and indexed. And I knew that if we played it right, we could detonate it in the middle of the courtroom where it would be impossible to ignore. My lawyer and I agreed on a strategy the night before. We weren't going to walk in and immediately accuse the judge of corruption. We weren't stupid. We knew the risk of triggering contempt or getting shut down before we could present the evidence. Instead, we started subtle. When the session opened, my attorney stood and raised a procedural motion. He said we had newly obtained information that called into question the integrity of the court proceedings. The judge immediately bristled, cutting him off mid-sentence, asking what exactly he meant by that. There was tension in the air, even the court clerk stopped typing. You could feel the room tightening around us. That's when I stood up. I wasn't supposed to speak. The plan had been for my lawyer to gradually guide the court toward a formal request for judicial recusal, possibly followed by a motion to dismiss. But when I saw the judge's eyes narrow and his hand hover near the gavel, ready to shut it all down before it started, I didn't care about protocol. I pulled the folder from my bag, walked toward the bench, and held it up high enough for everyone in the courtroom to see. I spoke clearly, without trembling, without apology. Your Honor, we have documented proof that your son received over $400,000 through a consulting firm that does not exist, paid for through a series of shell companies partially owned or controlled by the defendant in this case. The payments began shortly before your denial of our motion for recusal and continued during active litigation. The firm, Falcon Ridge Consulting, is registered to your son's address, but has no phone number, no tax filings, no office, and no clients other than entities connected to Charles Maddox. I have receipts, bank statements, corporate filings, and an affidavit from a former accountant. The judge stared at me, frozen. His face drained of color, his lips slightly parted like he'd forgotten how to breathe. He didn't reach for the gavel. He didn't speak. He didn't even blink for a long, stretched-out moment that felt like the entire room was holding its breath. The silence was thick, electric. Then he finally reached for the folder. I handed it to the bailiff, who brought it to the bench. He opened it slowly, flipping through the first few pages, scanning the documents, not speaking, but his hands started to tremble. My father didn't speak either. He sat 2 rows back, his lawyer stiff beside him, and for once he didn't look smug or calculating. He looked wrong. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were darting, first to the judge, then to the bailiff, then to me. He looked like a man watching a structure collapse and realizing too late that he was standing underneath it. I didn't look away. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to know that I had found the cracks in the empire he built and that I wasn't afraid to pull it all down if I had to. The judge sat still for a long time, reading page after page while the courtroom remained completely silent. Finally, he cleared his throat, but the sound came out dry and broken. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and uneven. This court declares a mistrial. There was no explanation, no attempt to justify the decision. He stood, mumbled something about court being adjourned, and walked out of the room as quickly as possible, leaving the folder on the bench behind him. He didn't even take the evidence with him. The gavel never struck. The room erupted, not in sound, but in motion. Lawyers whispered, court officials began shuffling paperwork, and a few people stood in confusion, unsure of what had just happened. My lawyer turned to me, eyes wide, not in shock but in something closer to awe. He didn't smile, but there was a flicker of it trying to push through. And then I looked at my father. Charles Maddox was not the same man who had laughed in my face, not the man who had brushed off my warnings, not the man who had strutted into court with his entourage and his fake sense of control. He looked gutted. His shoulders slumped. His mouth was slightly open, but he said nothing. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, his knuckles white, like he was trying to hold himself together with the only thing left that hadn't been exposed. I watched him break without touching him, without raising my voice, without saying anything cruel or vengeful. I just stood there, and he knew. He knew I had pulled the one thread he thought I'd never find. He knew the game was over. The fallout began almost immediately. Within 48 hours of the mistrial, the documents we had introduced in court found their way into the hands of the press. I didn't leak them, someone in the courtroom must have, but once the lid was off, it blew wide open. The first story ran on a local investigative blog that covered political and judicial corruption, and from there, it snowballed into something national. Headlines began appearing across major outlets, each one more damning than the last. Business mogul accused of bribing judge through son's shell company. Courtroom corruption exposed in explosive trial documents. CEO allegedly bought judicial influence to silence co-owner daughter. The story had every element of scandal the media devoured: corporate greed, family betrayal, a crooked judge, dirty money, and a woman who refused to stay silent. By the end of that week, Judge Alan Whitmore had formally resigned. The Judicial Ethics Committee launched an investigation, but he didn't wait for their findings. He vanished from public view altogether. His son, Carter, was arrested after a short investigation confirmed the consulting firm he had supposedly founded never performed a single service for any of the entities that had paid it. Under pressure and with no plausible explanation for the $400,000 in transfers, he confessed during questioning, admitting that the money came from Charles Maddox through layered accounts and that he had been instructed to keep it quiet in exchange for strategic legal favors. His plea deal came quickly, and as part of it, he handed over emails and text messages implicating both my father and the judge directly. The pieces fell with stunning speed. Criminal charges followed like hail. My father was served first with a subpoena, then with a full indictment: wire fraud, forgery, perjury, conspiracy to commit bribery, and obstruction of justice. Federal investigators raided his home and office. The company's servers were seized, and every transaction from the last 3 years came under forensic review. Once the charges were public, his entire support system collapsed. The law firm that had represented him, one of the most expensive in the state, issued a terse statement and dropped him as a client, citing a fundamental breach of professional integrity. Business allies who had once attended his fundraisers and board meetings disappeared overnight, their public profiles suddenly scrubbed of any association with him. Former partners cut ties, board members resigned from companies he held shares in, and even his country club membership was quietly revoked. Internally, the company, my company, was in crisis, but for the first time in over a year, I had the authority to act without being undermined, blocked, or ignored. Once the judge was removed and the mistrial declared, my ownership was no longer contested. There were no more legal games to play. The evidence of fraud and manipulation had been overwhelming, and his position became legally untenable. My legal team filed an emergency motion to freeze Charles's access to company funds and remove him from any operational role, and within days, I was reinstated as the rightful co-owner, and then, officially, as the sole acting CEO. There was no ceremony, no handoff, just a signed order and a room full of people looking at me for direction. The state of the company was worse than I had imagined. Financials were riddled with red flags, funds siphoned into projects that never existed, contracts signed with fake vendors, entire departments gutted and left unstaffed. Employee morale was in the gutter. Half the senior staff had either resigned or been fired under Charles's chaotic rule, and many of the remaining employees were burned out, distrustful, and shell-shocked from the instability. The brand's reputation was damaged, with client relationships frayed or abandoned altogether. But underneath the wreckage, there was still something worth saving. The bones of what my mother built were still there, buried, bruised, but intact. I called an all-staff meeting my first full day back. No announcements, no stage, just a raw, open gathering in the old main conference room. I stood at the front and told them the truth, not the PR version, not a corporate memo, but the full weight of what had happened. I told them what my father did, how he had hijacked the company, how I had fought to honor my mother's vision, and how I knew we had a long road ahead of us to rebuild. I didn't offer guarantees. I just promised that the lies were over. That the person running the company from this point forward was someone who had earned it, not through bloodline, but through battle. People didn't applaud. There was no movie moment. But as the room slowly emptied, employees came up to me one by one, shaking my hand, saying thank you, asking how they could help. It was quiet solidarity, the kind that matters more than any public statement. In the days that followed, I began the process of reconstructing the company piece by piece, rehiring critical staff, auditing every contract, reaching out to lost clients, and putting in place strict financial controls that made future manipulation impossible. It was grueling. It was exhausting. But it was finally mine to rebuild. As for my father, I haven't spoken to him since the mistrial. I watched him leave the courthouse that day surrounded by a sea of cameras, face grim and shoulders hunched like a man trying to fold himself out of view. He no longer looked like a mogul. He looked like what he was, a man who bet everything on his ability to cheat the system and lost. His name is now synonymous with corruption, not power. His empire collapsed not with a bang but with the quiet, methodical exposure of every secret he tried to bury. And I was the one who brought it all into the light. The second trial didn't feel like a continuation, it felt like a cleansing, a correction of everything that had gone wrong the first time. The courtroom was different, stripped of the false gravitas that had once shielded my father's manipulations. This judge, unlike the last, didn't greet attorneys like old friends or indulge pointless theatrics. His name was Judge Raymond Elridge, and from the moment proceedings began, it was clear he wasn't interested in narratives, he wanted facts, timelines, documents, and sworn truth. He had a reputation for being relentless in his demand for clarity and known across the state for being incorruptible. There were no casual glances exchanged, no sideways smiles between the bench and the defense table. The air felt cleaner. This time, the courtroom actually belonged to the law. The prosecution came armed with a mountain of evidence, some of it collected during the first trial, but much of it expanded thanks to the criminal investigation that followed. There were forensic accountants, federal agents, former employees, all lined up to give sworn statements under oath. There were bank statements tracking payments through shell corporations. There were vendor contracts approved without legitimate deliverables. There were emails where my father discussed routing funds through dummy entities to avoid my approval. But nothing hit harder than the witnesses. Helen was the first to take the stand. She sat down with a composure that only someone who had waited years to be heard could carry. She laid out everything, how she had managed my father's personal accounts, how he insisted on using names she didn't recognize, how he created shell companies to disguise payouts, and how, when she questioned the legality of what he was doing, he threatened her job and then pressured her into signing non-disclosure agreements. She walked the court through dozens of transactions, complete with backup documentation, and never once faltered under cross-examination. When the defense tried to discredit her, accusing her of being a disgruntled ex-employee, she simply opened a binder and pointed to her resignation letter, submitted with a detailed report of the irregularities that had been ignored by the firm's leadership. Then it was my turn. I stood where I had once been interrupted, dismissed, and spoken over, and I told the court everything, how I had been cut out of my own company, how my father forged my signature to secure a loan, how he funneled company funds into his personal ventures and lavished resources on people with no qualifications. I explained how the previous trial was corrupted, how the judge had personal ties to my father, and how the mistrial wasn't just a legal technicality but a moment of truth finally being allowed to break through the machinery of privilege and power. I testified about the staff meetings I wasn't invited to, the decisions made behind my back, the financial destruction I had tried to stop before it was too late. My voice didn't shake. I didn't raise it. I just told the truth, piece by piece, without apology. The defense had nothing. They tried to argue that my father's decisions were made in good faith, that he had the experience to steer the company through a difficult transition, that any financial missteps were due to grief or confusion. But the documents contradicted every word. The fake consulting firms, the undisclosed payments, the missing funds, the forged approvals, none of it could be explained away. And the judge wasn't having any of it. Every time the defense tried to twist the facts into character attacks, Judge Elridge shut them down. He sustained our objections, asked follow-up questions of his own, and made it clear that spin would not stand in place of substance. By day 5, the courtroom was quiet, exhausted from the pace and weight of the proceedings. My father had not taken the stand. His lawyers looked like they had aged a decade. They had no defense left, just the brittle hope that somehow the evidence wouldn't be enough. But it was. When Judge Elridge returned with his ruling, there was no drama in his voice, just clarity. He declared that full ownership of the company was to be transferred to me, effective immediately. My father was stripped of all legal and financial ties to the business, barred from serving on its board, representing it, or profiting from it in any way. Furthermore, he was ordered to pay restitution, an exact figure based on the forensic audit that tracked every dollar he had diverted or misused. It was over $1 million. The judge didn't soften the language. He stated plainly that Charles Maddox had engaged in sustained, deliberate corporate malfeasance, and that his actions had caused direct harm to both the company and its rightful co-owner. I didn't cry when the verdict was read. I didn't smile. I just exhaled, like I had been holding my breath for over a year and finally let it go. My father sat motionless, his hands folded in front of him, his face blank, but I could see the cracks. The man who once laughed in my face, who mocked my role and erased my voice, was now sitting in a courtroom stripped of the lies that had once protected him. The mask had fallen, and there was nothing left behind it but the truth. The trial didn't give me back the time I lost, or the company in the state my mother left it, or the sense of safety I had once felt in my own family. But it gave me something else: accountability, legitimacy, control. And most importantly, it gave me the chance to rebuild everything on my terms, with the truth finally carved into the record, where no one could ever take it away again. Justice didn't come all at once. It came in waves, slow, deliberate, and with the full weight of the law behind it. After the second trial ended and the civil ruling transferred full control of the company to me, federal authorities took over. The documents Helen had provided, along with testimony from forensic investigators, showed not just corporate fraud, but interstate wire fraud, obstruction of justice, bribery, conspiracy, and tax evasion. The Department of Justice opened a formal case within weeks, and grand jury indictments followed soon after. Judge Alan Whitmore, once a man whose name carried power inside courthouse walls, found himself on the other side of the system he had manipulated. He pled guilty under a deal that required him to admit to accepting improper benefits while presiding over an active case. There was no drawn-out courtroom drama, just a quiet acknowledgement of guilt and a sentencing hearing where his lawyer tried to paint a picture of a man who had lost his way. The judge presiding over his case had no patience for it. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, stripped of his judicial pension, and permanently barred from practicing law in any capacity. Watching the man who had once dismissed me from his courtroom now stand behind bars as his sentence was read brought a kind of closure I didn't think I would ever feel. His son, Carter Whitmore, didn't get off easily either. Despite cooperating with the investigation and providing testimony that helped bring the full extent of the fraud into the light, the court still held him accountable. The consulting firm he'd operated had received hundreds of thousands of dollars through fraudulent invoices, and even if he hadn't fully understood the scale at the start, he had knowingly continued to accept and disguise the money. He was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, with probation and mandatory restitution payments. His confession was public, his name was published in every article that covered the scandal, and any future he had imagined in politics or business disappeared with a single court filing. And then there was my father. Charles Maddox had spent decades building an identity around control. He controlled meetings, people, narratives. He controlled rooms with his presence, controlled decisions with his tone, controlled outcomes with money and intimidation. But in the face of federal prosecution, none of that mattered. No amount of tailored suits or carefully worded statements could erase the paper trail or the sworn testimony. He tried to fight it. He hired a new legal team, pushed for delays, filed motions, but none of it stuck. Every avenue he used to escape responsibility collapsed under the weight of evidence he couldn't deny. The courtroom where he was sentenced felt colder than the one where we'd fought over the company. The judge called him methodical, entitled, and dangerous to the integrity of business and judicial systems alike. The sentence was 8 years in federal prison, no possibility of early parole, and full asset seizure of all profits obtained through fraudulent means. His real estate, investment accounts, and hidden holdings in shell companies were frozen, sold, or reclaimed by the government. He walked out of that courtroom not as a mogul, not as a patriarch, not even as a disgraced businessman, but as a federal inmate with nothing left but the clothes on his back and a prison identification number. The public humiliation came quickly. News outlets didn't soften the blow. His mugshot ran on front pages across business sections nationwide. His name was scrubbed from boardrooms and foundations. Invitations stopped arriving. His so-called friends and colleagues issued carefully worded statements of disapproval before quietly removing him from their networks. And then, without fanfare, Vanessa left him. The woman he had installed into a 6-figure role with no qualifications vanished the moment the money stopped flowing. She deleted her social media accounts, moved out of the condo he had paid for, and never once showed up in court or issued a public defense. The empire he had built over years of manipulation, lies, and arrogance crumbled faster than I ever could have imagined. The offices he once called his own were rebranded, the buildings sold or leased under new names, the partnerships dissolved. Employees who had once feared him spoke freely now, sharing stories that painted a clearer picture of the damage he had done from behind closed doors. And him? The man who once silenced rooms with a glance, who dictated schedules down to the minute, who decided who mattered and who didn't, he lost everything. In prison, he couldn't even choose when to sleep, when to shower, or when to eat lunch. The control he had obsessed over for his entire life was gone. No assistants, no board meetings, no secret accounts. Just a cell, a number, and a daily routine designed by someone else. He had built a world around power and domination, and now he couldn't even hold a pen without permission. There was no part of his life untouched by the consequences. His legacy, the company, the image he curated, shattered. Every mask he wore had been ripped off, not by revenge or vengeance, but by facts, by evidence, by truth spoken in rooms where he once thought he was untouchable. He had tried to erase me. He had tried to rewrite my mother's legacy into his own. But in the end, the only thing he built was a house of cards. And when it fell, it buried him. Renaming the company was the first thing I did, not as an act of branding or strategy, but as an act of reclamation. The old name carried too much history, too much pain, too many fingerprints that weren't mine. It had been twisted and corrupted, used as a shield for fraud and as a stage for someone else's ego. I wanted something that honored where we came from but made it clear we were no longer part of the past that tried to bury us. I chose a name that reflected my mother's legacy, quiet strength, dignity, and craftsmanship. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't corporate. It was personal. And the day the new signage went up on the front of the building, I stood outside and watched as the last trace of my father's presence was peeled away, letter by letter. Rebuilding the company wasn't just about numbers or strategy. It was about people. Every relationship my father had shattered needed to be mended. Clients who had been ignored, overcharged, or lied to had to be contacted one by one. I didn't send out mass emails. I picked up the phone. I scheduled face-to-face meetings. I listened. I apologized. I told them the truth. I showed them what had changed. Some didn't come back right away. Some never did. But many did, cautiously at first, then with growing trust, until one by one, they began sending us projects again, signing new contracts, recommending us to others. They weren't just returning to a vendor. They were returning to the values my mother had built the company on: quality, honesty, consistency. Internally, I rebuilt from the ground up. I rehired staff who had been driven out, if they were willing to return, and in many cases, I promoted those who had been overlooked and underestimated. I implemented transparent hiring policies, strict financial oversight, and mandatory ethics training for every executive-level employee. The days of backroom deals and inflated salaries for unqualified insiders were over. In their place came mentorship programs, profit-sharing incentives, and a culture where no one was punished for asking questions. For the first time in years, people walked into the building with pride. There was no fear hanging in the hallways, no whisper networks about what might happen next. There was focus, energy, laughter. I didn't just restore morale, I helped it evolve into something deeper. People cared again. They believed again. One of the most important decisions I made was to start a scholarship in my mother's name. Not for show. Not for PR. But because I knew who she was and what she believed in. She had built the business with her hands, yes, but also with her heart, and part of her heart always belonged to the young women she mentored, the ones who reminded her of herself at 19, scraping together enough money for art school and sewing samples out of scrap fabric. The scholarship supports first-generation college students pursuing design, textile engineering, or small business entrepreneurship. Every year, when we review the applications, I see 100 versions of who my mother might have been if she were starting out today. Every award letter we send feels like a small piece of justice being handed forward. And through it all, I came to understand that what I had rebuilt wasn't just a business. It was proof. Proof that the truth matters. Proof that legacy isn't defined by inheritance but by action. Proof that a woman dismissed, mocked, and silenced can still stand up, speak, and change the story. I walked into that office every morning not with arrogance or entitlement, but with certainty. I knew who I was. I wasn't someone's daughter playing dress-up. I wasn't a co-owner sidelined in silence. I wasn't a name buried in court transcripts. I was the CEO. The leader. The survivor of a war I never asked to fight but refused to lose. Every room I entered, every decision I made, every deal I negotiated carried the weight of what it had taken to get there. And I carried it with pride. Not because I needed to prove anything anymore, but because I had already proven everything. I stood in the ashes of corruption and chose to build something better. And I did.